Okay, it's 12:02, so we'll get started. So hello everybody. Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn on Inclusive Presentations. For those who haven't met me before, my name is Jeffery. I'm the Accessibility and Transport Integration Manager for TransPennine Express. On the slide, there is a photograph of me on the left. I'm stood smiling on the concourse at Manchester Piccadilly Station. I have brown hair and I'm wearing a light blue shirt and a black jumper. I'm holding a white cane with a red handle. Thank you very much for joining this session, and if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature in Microsoft Teams, and I'll come to these at the very end. You should see the Q&A icon at the very top of your screen. It's two little speech bubbles. If you'd prefer to ask your questions by email, you can scan the QR code on the screen beside my photo, or you can email chris.jeffrey@tpexpress.co.uk, and I'll get back to you after the session. Please be aware this session is being recorded for the Young Rail Professionals Network. So when answering your questions, I'll just use your first name for your privacy. And also be aware that this is a public webinar and not solely attended by TransPennine Express colleagues. So don't share anything external in the chat or Q&A, please. Now, if there's something this industry does a lot of, it's presentations. And it wouldn't surprise me if many of you watching this session have already seen one today. When you're giving a presentation, often you will not know the accessibility requirements of the people in your audience. There could be people with visual impairments. They might find it difficult to see the content of your slides. There could be people with hearing impairments who might find it difficult to hear what you're saying. And there could be people with a neurodiverse condition who might find your instructions unclear or the information you're presenting difficult to take in. Those are just a few examples of the different accessibility requirements that people receiving your presentation might have, but there are of course many more. Today's Lunch and Learn has been designed to give you a brief introduction to the many ways that you can make your presentations more accessible and inclusive by default. Together, we'll talk about planning your presentation, designing it, and presenting it. And as I mentioned before, there will also be an opportunity for you to ask questions at the end. So the first step is to plan your presentation. In my opinion, the best way to start is by asking yourself a really simple question, and that's, is PowerPoint the right tool? On this slide, there are 7 app icons, which I'll explain. PowerPoint is great at presenting content visually to groups of many sizes when you have a mixture of written and graphical content to show. But sometimes it's misused when another software package will be more appropriate. Need to make an action tracker? These work best in Excel because the content can flow better across the width of the screen and formulas can be used to hide the completed actions, thus reducing screen clutter. If you're writing something like a report or a strategy, these work best in Word and perhaps then converted to a PDF so that they can be easily read both on a screen and when printed. Something like a poster should be made in Publisher, Canva or Photoshop to give more creative freedom for you as an author. And for a how-to guide, you might make a video to support people with a visual learning style and run this alongside a one-page step-by-step document for people who learn better with written instructions. So selecting the right tool for the job not only sets the foundation for more accessible content, but it makes it easier for you as a creator as well. It's also really important to consider how people will view your content. So let's imagine we've had a management restructure and a presentation is being given to introduce everyone to the new team and their roles. This might come across really well on an office-based team viewing the slides on their laptop, as shown in the image on the left of the PowerPoint slide on a laptop screen. But for a driver who can only access the slides through their mobile phone, the content is far too small to read, and having to zoom in and out constantly makes it clunky to use. And this is demonstrated in the graphic on the right, which is a smartphone that's considerably smaller than the laptop. In this fictional scenario, a variety of presentation methods should have been used to convey the information about the restructure. The PowerPoint can still be done, but it should be supplemented by an email briefing, which can more easily be digested on smaller screens, and a video and/or podcast would be a great way for people to digest the information on the go. Now, I'll cover how to run a presentation via Microsoft Teams later, but if you intend to deliver your presentation in person, make sure you collect as much information about your attendees' accessibility and, if relevant, their dietary requirements in advance. Ideally, you should do that before you secure your venue to make sure it's physically accessible to everybody that's coming before it's too late to change. You should also consider transport to and from the venue. I think we're quite good at that in rail, as we tend to host our in-person events near railway stations, but not everyone would arrive by train, so make sure you consider parking, rideshare, bus and other transport methods. It's also good practice to offer to meet delegates at the transport hub if needed, as some people might not be able to get from there to your venue unaided. For those of us in the public sector in particular, it's important to consider these aspects early so that they can form part of your equality impact assessment. Whether in person or online, you should also consider how long it will take to deliver your presentation. When you've created your content, it's good practice to run through the slides with yourself and allow enough time for people to ask questions. It's probably better to allocate a little bit more time than you think you'll need. Also, if your session holds a regular time slot, for example every week, consider each time whether you'll need the full time that's been allocated. If not, reduce the length of the session ahead of time and give people clear expectations and to give people the opportunity to reorganize their day. You should also make sure you have a clear agenda shared in advance of the session so that attendees know what to expect. Now that you've planned your presentation, it's time to design your slides. It's important to make your slides accessible so that everyone can take part. This ensures that everyone is engaged and able to interact with your content if appropriate. In the next few slides, I'll be sharing various tips specific to Microsoft PowerPoint. But if you use another app like Google Slides or Canva, all of these features are still available. They just might be located in different menus. It's important to give each slide a unique and descriptive title. This helps people to understand the slide, particularly if it only contains a photo or a graph. Also, people with visual impairments using screen reading software can use the slide titles to tab through from slide to slide at pace. That's why it's important that each slide's title is unique. Otherwise, it would be impossible to distinguish one slide from another when listed. Most slide design templates include a title placeholder which automatically highlights the title for you. You can check this by going to the Outline view, which is in the View menu. This is shown in the screenshot of PowerPoint on this slide, where each slide's title is shown in a numbered list down the left-hand side. Setting the right font size is vital to ensuring that your slides are readable. On this slide, sentences are shown in font sizes 5, 10, 15, 18, 24, and then 36. It is recommended to never use fonts smaller than size 18, and I would advise using size 24 if you can. That's the size that's been used throughout this presentation. Titles should be slightly larger. If you're using size 24 for your content, size 36 works well for titles. You should also consider the font carefully. A sans serif font is recommended. In this presentation, I've used Barnschrift, which is a digital variation of DIN 1451, created by the German Institute for Standardization in 1931, which was intended for use on road signs, thus offering excellent readability. Other good fonts, as demonstrated on this slide, include Calibri, Verdana, and Arial. More stylized fonts at the bottom of the slide, such as Times New Roman, Forte, and Lucida handwriting, should be avoided, as these are more difficult to read, especially at speed. It's also advisable to avoid using bold or italics to add emphasis to certain words or phrases. This can be distracting, but also isn't picked up by screen reading software, so people with visual impairments might miss this. It's an easy trap to fall into, but don't reduce your font size to fit more content onto your slides. It's better to have 20 accessible slides than 10 slides that people struggle to read. Not everything has to be a one-pager. Slide transitions, like the one I just used for this slide, which folded the previous slide into a paper aeroplane that flew away, should be avoided. To be fair, this was deliberately an extreme example, of course, but any slide transition can be an unwanted distraction. Animations should also be used sparingly and only to help viewers focus. For example, if you're talking through a list of items, you might like each one to appear as you say it. This is good for things like recapping a process you've just taught, where you want to ask your audience what the next step is before showing it. When you do use animations, these should be simple, such as a fade in, and you should avoid any movement, blinking, or flashing. Using the right colors for your slides is important. I've deliberately made this slide difficult to read, so I will be talking through it. In the header, I've changed the background of the arrow behind the title to a much lighter shade of blue than the previous slides, but I've left the text white. There now isn't enough contrast between the two colors. While some people might be able to read this, many will find it impossible. I've also changed the background of the slide to a gradient, which goes from a light grey at the top to a darker grey at the bottom. Not only will some people find this distracting, the colour of the text on top of it hasn't been adjusted, so whilst it's readable towards the top, it becomes more difficult further down the slide. Let's put this slide back to normal. That's better. Using colour can be useful to indicate different things. A great example of this is a RAG status, like shown at the bottom of the slide, where red, amber and green statuses are indicated by the background colours in the table. But to someone who is colorblind, this table would look very different. You should consider adding symbols or descriptions alongside. In this example, there is a cross against the red background, an alert symbol against the amber background, and a tick against the green. Images can really enhance a presentation, but they can also be a distraction. Try to avoid using images for the sake of it, and when you do use images, make sure you provide a description for people with visual impairments, both verbally and by using alt text. Alt text is picked up by screen reading software and can be added in PowerPoint by right-clicking on an image and selecting View Alt Text. The screenshot on this slide shows the alt text field in PowerPoint. The description entered reads, a screenshot of Microsoft PowerPoint's outline view, which shows 16 presentation slides listed in order with their slide titles adjacent. Below that is a tick box labeled marked as decorative. You should only tick that if the image is purely for decoration only. For example, in this slide deck, the TPE logo star appears in the bottom right-hand corner of each slide. Hearing TransPennine Express logo star through a screen reader after every slide would get quite annoying, so this image has been marked as decorative to prevent that. When writing descriptions, strike a balance between detail and length. For graphs, explain what is shown, including any data. Simply saying a graph detailing this year's customer service scores isn't enough. Instead, provide a brief summary, for example, if there is an upward trend in that data. For photographs, describe what is visible, including what people look like and what they're doing. You should never place text over images unless the image is very faint, like the presentation's title slide. It makes the text really difficult to read. Tables can be difficult for screen reader users when presented in PowerPoint, so try to avoid using them at all if possible. The same goes for columns of text, as some screen readers will try to read them across the screen rather than in their intended order. When showing graphs and diagrams, as previously mentioned, ensure you've provided a description. Also, avoid screenshotting them from another app and pasting them in, as then all the data that a screen reader could use is then lost. Instead, copy the content directly onto the slide so that it's formatted properly. This will also help you as a creator because, for example, if you copy a graph from Excel, then change the data in the spreadsheet, the graph will automatically update for you too. There is a lot to think about in the slides we've just been through, but there is an easy way to check that the accessibility of your deck is okay before you finalize it. At the bottom left of the PowerPoint window is the accessibility checker, noted by the symbol of a person and shown on the top right of this slide. Clicking this will launch the accessibility checking tool in your sidebar. This automated tool checks for several accessibility issues in your presentation, including the provision of alt text on your images, unique slide titles, color contrast, and the slide's reading order, which ensures that screen reading software reads aloud the items on your slide in the correct order. It also provides a helpful description of why any errors it finds are important to address, and it will help you fix those errors as well. We've now covered how to make your slides accessible, but how do you present them in an inclusive way? We'll look at in-person presentations first. If you're presenting in front of an audience, you should try and face them as much as possible. This can be tricky if you're reading notes or pointing at things on a presentation screen behind you, but maintaining focus on your audience as much as possible will help to project your voice and help people who rely on lip reading to follow your presentation. If you have a long presentation or multiple people presenting, be sure to provide rest breaks at certain intervals. This helps both your presenters and your delegates to maintain their concentration and take a breather when needed. If you're planning a networking lunch, make sure you schedule this for more time than a normal lunch, as some people might prefer to eat separately first before networking. And I said it at the start, but remember to check for attendees' accessibility requirements before the session to ensure that everything is in place. For example, I have a visual impairment myself, so I like to have the slides printed out. This means I can sit anywhere in the room, rather than having to be right at the front and still follow the presentation. If you're delivering your presentation online, keep your camera on if you feel comfortable doing so. Be mindful that some people might not want to have theirs on. Everyone will have their own reasons for this, but it could be because of body confidence, because of an accessibility requirement, for example, the need to stim or regulate during the presentation, or because they're dialing to the meeting from somewhere unusual like their car as a way to be safe and quiet and comfortable. It could be good to blur your background to avoid distractions, or if you're using a custom background, make sure it follows the same principles that your slides would. If your presentation is being delivered using Microsoft Teams, be sure to share your slides in the right way. By clicking Share and then Screen, people will see exactly what you can see, which is fine sometimes, but means if you only have one screen, you can't see the meeting chat, your notes, or if people have raised their hand. Instead, scroll down to PowerPoint Live and share your presentation this way. You can then present using this presenter view, which shows your slides and notes beside each other and allows you to access other Teams features like the chat, Q&A, polls, and to see whether anyone's raised their hand. Your viewers will also be able to go backwards and forwards through the deck if they miss something, but do bear this in mind if you're running a quiz with the answers on a later slide, as people will be able to jump forward and cheat. PowerPoint Live does let you turn on automatic captions, but I don't recommend this. Many people with hearing impairments will use their own software for this, and the feedback I've had is that having two sets of captions running at the same time can be confusing. So we've talked in detail about what you can do as a presenter to make your presentations more accessible and inclusive, but I've also got some tips for when you're viewing someone else's. Keep your microphone muted until it's your turn to speak so that others can't hear your background noise. And remember that as a presenter, you can turn microphones on and off as well if you need to. If you need to make a slide bigger, hover over it with your mouse, hold the control key and scroll with your mouse wheel to zoom in and out. If you'd like to contribute, raise your virtual hand. The presenter can see what order people raise their hand in, so can ensure nobody gets missed. So that concludes the slides I have for today, but I want to leave you with a final thought. After listening to this Lunch and Learn, you might be feeling a little overwhelmed, and that's fine. Everything I've shared with you today is a combination of my own thoughts, guidance from organisations like the Royal National Institute of Blind People, and best practice from the rail industry. But all of this is no match to having a conversation with your attendees to find out how you can make their presentation more inclusive. Don't be afraid to ask about having that conversation. And by doing so, you'll empower yourself to deliver accessible and inclusive presentations by talking to your attendees at the right time to ensure that everyone can feel included in what you're doing. By making your presentations more accessible and inclusive, you empower your colleagues, customers, and stakeholders to be more engaged with what you're doing and to be more productive. So thank you very much for your time today. As promised, you can ask questions using the Q&A feature in Microsoft Teams. That's the icon at the top with the Q&A. I will just check it's turned on properly, as I noted someone in the chat saying it wasn't working, so I'll double check that in a second. You can use the meeting chat as well if you'd like to ask your question, but be aware that obviously your name will come up beside that as well. So give me a couple of seconds to check it's all open and working, and then I'll start answering anything that comes through. But if you don't have any questions, thank you very much for coming along, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. I can see the question from David about the font, sorry, called Barnstift. Is that the font that's being used here? Yes, it is. Thank you all for your feedback as well. That's really great to read. If you do have any questions, drop them in, or you can email them across as well. So I've got a question in the Q&A from Christina, who has asked in what circumstances you would do an equality impact assessment. It very much depends on what sort of presentation or event that you're running. I would suggest that for a sort of routine, kind of hour-long meeting via Teams, you wouldn't really need to do something like that. But if you were doing a meeting in person, or a meeting that went on for a long time, or at a venue you wouldn't normally use, so if you're going out of your normal office, for example, that would be the time when an equality impact assessment would be appropriate to make sure that the needs of everyone attending has been considered. I see a message from Marin about this font. Is it better than the other three types we mentioned? Not really. I think as long as you're using a font that's of that sort of style, I think any of those are appropriate, really. Just go with what works best with your slide deck and what your sort of brand team would expect to see, because I know they'll have an opinion on it as well. It's my favorite personally, but any of those fonts are suitable, so go for whichever one fits in best. I see a message from Abiola. Would the slide deck be shared? You should receive it automatically when this session has finished. If you don't, it will be available depending on where you work. I believe it's going on to a Network Rail toolkit. It will be published internally at TPE, and it will be published by the Young Rail Professionals Network as well. So keep a lookout, and you should be able to watch it back and share with your colleagues. Got a question from Aaron, who's asking about any advice on specific movement and animations to avoid. Honestly, I would avoid as much animation and movement as possible. If you do want to have items in a list come in one by one, I would honestly just make them just appear. No flying in across the screen or anything like that. This can be really distracting and unsettling for people viewing. There are, of course, some circumstances where it might work. I think we've all seen the kind of big reveal with the curtains opening. Then you're making a bit more of a video piece there, aren't you? And I think that's probably more acceptable. But in terms of, a presentation you're routinely delivering to your colleagues, I'd steer clear of pretty much all movement and animation, to be honest. Excellent. That appears we've got to the end of the questions then. So thank you very much, everybody. Really appreciate your time today. Thank you very much for coming along. And if you think of any questions later, please do email them across. And I hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you very much.